And joining us now for further discussion on the potential executive order today regarding the Department of Education is David Carlucci, Democratic strategist and former New York State Senator, as well as Tony Kinnett, national correspondent for the Daily Signal, former teacher and host of the radio show and podcast Tony Kinnett Cast. Both of you, thank you so much for coming on today. David, I want to start by asking you this, right? Education Secretary Linda McMahon, she says that these decisions, this is about sending education back to the states. Now, the administration, it sees this as an issue that's better left in states' hands. Should they be able to take on more responsibility in this sector?
Well, the states already do 90% of the funding. The federal government doesn't weigh in on criteria in terms of curriculum. So I don't really understand this. It's like the Department of Education right now, the Secretary of Education, the president, they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. They say they want the states to do it. Well, the states already do it. What the Secretary of Education is there for is a complement to our education system to make sure that our children get the best education possible. And what this looks like through the president's executive order is that they're absolving themselves of the responsibility of educating our children. So they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. What it's really about is cutting funding and making it less accessible, a great education in this nation. So it's very unfortunate.
Tony, I'll give you a moment to respond.
Well, unfortunately, my counterpart started out with a factually incorrect statement that the federal government doesn't provide curricular guidance to schools. The government money that does go from the federal coffers in the Department of Education over to schools via grants is tied to curricular aims and pedagogies. I remember from my science class, and then when I was a science administrator, that federal grants were tied directly to what we taught our students and how we taught it. So that's just untrue here. Uncoupling, I should say, the federal government from the state education process. If it's true that 90% of the education process is already taken care of by the states, then why is it necessary to pump billions of dollars a year into the federal process, which is doing nothing to improve the state of education in the United States?
Tony, building off of that, by providing funding, the Education Department, we have seen, has been able to impose changes in schools nationwide, like we saw with the last administration's interpretation of Title IX, which compelled them to allow students in sports teams based on gender identity rather than biological sex. So my question here, should the federal government have any role in how schools operate?
I think that if you're maintaining discriminatory policies under the Civil Rights Act, I think that's incredibly important if we're looking at how tax dollars are spent. But if we're looking at what's taught in schools, if we're looking at the money that goes into the curriculum, into the pedagogy, if we're looking at how we're going to maintain standardization, then the Department of Education should return to its pre-Carter administration role, which is when it was the Office of Education maintaining statistical data, talking about grants, and obviously the discussion of the fact sheet that your reporter mentioned earlier in front of the White House, the administration of certain things like Pell Grants, that's appropriate. But as far as maintaining what students learn and teach and perhaps individual policies, that's outside of what the scope of the federal government was intended to be.
And David, what do you make of Tony's point here about this delegation of responsibilities?
Yeah, again, I think it's speaking out of both sides of our mouth, because it's about what I hear Tony talking about is cherry picking, right? Saying, oh, well, there are certain things that we should do on the federal level. But what the Secretary of Education is saying, what Donald Trump is saying, is that the federal government should absolve themselves because there has been an overreach in curriculum, which I disagree with my friend here that I don't think that is true. Yes, the departments of education on the state level, the school boards, they have the responsibility of curriculum. What the federal government is doing is complementing them in making sure that our children are getting the best education possible. And what this simply is absolving the federal government from any responsibility, cutting funding that goes to our districts, goes to our states, go to our school districts, and help some of our most vulnerable students. So all I see it as is saying, yeah, the states, you're not doing it right, but we're not going to do anything to help you, and really just cowering away from the responsibility to educate our children. Even if it is messy and it is problematic at times, doesn't mean that we hide under the covers and absolve ourselves from this important responsibility.
Tony, what do you make of that concern that David's addressing there? Because there is concern out there that by cutting the Department of Education, it cuts funding to a lot of states that are underfunded or less wealthy than other states.
So Congress has actually allocated money directly to the Department of Education. That money doesn't disappear and poof into thin air. If the Department of Education is dissolved or is severely reduced in scope and size, that money then goes to the states. In David's case, in New York, I believe that the New York government would know the best needs of New York students and then be able to apply that money to students who need it most and make that available for school boards to use for, in a case of my particular passions, SPED or STEM systems as students with special needs. And if that's a student in Indiana, then that should be the Indiana government's responsibility. But federal swaths and blanket sweep approaches when it comes to federal policy implementation tend to leave out communities. It doesn't make it more effective. And we've seen that in every other area of government policy.
Well, David, talk to us more about this. I mean, what exactly can be done by individual states on an individual basis, or perhaps even alongside other states, in order to make sure that they have the funding that they need to help give students the best education they can?
Yeah, well, what's simply happening here is that I would agree with my friend here if this was all true and accurate, but it's kind of eating away from the intent. You put a graph up before that showed that 10% of the funding is coming from the federal government, from the Department of Education. They're posing this as a guise of a cost-saving measure, but yet we're talking about, oh, but you'll still have to fund education. And I hope that's true. So to your question, what this means is simply that instead of spending more on transportation or on social service nets, safety nets, it'll have to go towards education and meeting that hole that is being created by the federal government.
Now, of course, President Trump can't fully dismantle this education department unless he gets congressional approval to do so. Tony, how do you see this whole thing playing out over the coming weeks?
Well, to be completely honest with you, and I think my friend here will definitely agree that the federal agency policy and how Congress has set up or should I say codified the Department of Education, it's become a kind of a spaghetti bowl here. If you picture noodles going every which way, different things and pieces of various laws and statutes and precedents all working together. And you can't just run a pair of scissors through that and simply cut down the middle. You have to untangle what has become a very large knot. And I've spoken to a couple of representatives in Congress who are floating different bills on reimagining the role of the Department of Education. And I do think that Congress is going to have to put forward a measure to outline very clearly what the Department of Education or an Office of Education would do or wouldn't do. Because as we see right now in the judicial fights, gray areas are bad for the entire country. I'd like to see Congress, left side, right side, make it very clear what a department does, what it doesn't do, what it spends money on, et cetera.
David, to that point, gray areas, how do you hope the government and administration can work to clarify those things?
Yeah, I agree with Tony here. We need to not put the cart before the horse, and that's what's happening. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, I think he needs to another lesson in government 101 in terms of what does an executive order do. So it's a lot of showmanship. Then you have the Secretary of Education having to clarify, oh, well, I think this is what Donald Trump actually meant. And that's unfortunate. That causes a tremendous amount of gray area across our country. Teachers, parents, everyone involved in educating our children are very concerned because what's happening is Donald Trump is making these audacious statements and then leaving his press secretary and Secretary of Education to say, oh, well, yes, but what we're going to have to do is actually clarify and make sure we know what the Department of Education is supposed to be doing. And we don't know any of that. And so that's why it's putting the cart before the horse, causing an awful lot of confusion, an awful lot of gray area, having state legislatures, city governments that are responsible for educating our children running in circles, trying to figure out how they're going to make up this lack of funding that we believe is coming from the federal government.
Closing statements here, gentlemen. David, as a former New York State senator, I'm sure you have a pulse. You have a finger on the pulse of New York State's people. How are they feeling about the current administration's decisions regarding education, and what do they actually need?
Yeah, I think we talked about it before and talking about the lack of clarity, the uncertainty. And that's one of the biggest problems. It cripples the ability to plan, to make sure that there is a solid foundation, particularly for education, which I think is one of our most important roles. And yes, we want to make sure that politicians are not in the classroom teaching our children, but we also want to make sure that they still have a responsibility in educating our children. And it seems as if the White House right now wants to have their cake and eat it too, in terms of talk about the problems with education and then do nothing to solve it other than say it's up to you and you alone to do it. We are going to absolve ourselves of that responsibility. And that's the message that the White House is sending right now.
Tony, I'll leave the final word to you. You're a former teacher. You have experience in this sector. Tell us what you've been hearing the people around you say that they need.
Well, I've never heard a single teacher who has worked in this education system point out any metric, any point that the federal Department of Education has improved in education. There has not been a single thing since the Carter administration they've done to make things better for students. And I think that that money should not be going to a bunch of federal employees who aren't really doing anything anyway. For example, in the grant approval process, as many of the DOE employees are currently, many of those laid off now. What we're seeing is a lot of clamor for states and local governments who understand local needs to get that money directly. And as far as the absolving of responsibility, I have yet to find very many Americans at all that are suggesting what they really want is more governmental involvement in their daily lives and their daily communities because some federal employee knows better than them.
All right.
Well, that's the difference here. They want help and support. And what the federal government is doing now is saying, hey, you're on your own. And you're confusing
the DOE hasn't helped.
Curriculum.
Tell me one area the DOE's helped, and I'll believe you.
All right, gentlemen.
We could go through a list. It's,
all right, gentlemen.
Something that dates back.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to cut it off here for now. We're out of time. However, this is a very important conversation to be having. We will be keeping an eye on what President Trump announces later this afternoon. David Carlucci, Tony Kinnett, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks.